Good morning and good evening to our dear friends across the globe. Welcome to the webinar today. I'm Sharon Kell, an internist and geriatrician. I was trained in medicine at the University of Alabama and was in academic medicine for about 7 years. And since then, I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 23 years. I've held positions in med affairs, clinical development, and pharmacovigilance and safety. Working at Novartis, J&J, Impacts, Provention. I'm now consulting. And the topic for today's webinar is DSURs, Nuances, and Beyond. And as you know, DSUR encompasses an elaborate safety analysis of an investigational medicinal product. The strength of the document obviously depends on the quality of the safety analysis of various clinical trials, observational or epi studies, and non-clinical studies. So Team AWINSA, with its sharp acumen and eye for detail, has crossed many such milestones effortlessly. So in this webinar today, Sanjeev Milani and Mukta Chopra, who are co-founders and directors of AWINSA Life Sciences, will talk in detail about the management of the DSUR. So at the onset, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping topics. Please post your questions during the webinar and we will do our best to address them. And in case we're not able to, due to time constraints, we will try to respond to you by email. The webinar will be available for download on demand after a couple days. So with that, and at this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Mukta and Sanjeev, who are going to start today's presentation.
Sure, thanks, Sharon. So I'll just briefly introduce Mukta, who will start the session, and then later after Mukta finishes the session, then I'll talk about a few of the topics. So Dr. Mukta Chopra is the co-founder and director of AWINSA Life Sciences and has over 16 years of experience, including pharmacovigilance and clinical research. She was Associate Vice President for US Pharmacovigilance and Clinical Safety at AWINSA in her last role, and she was overseeing the delivery and operation from India, which included but not limited to case processing, aggregate reporting, literature monitoring, and signal detection. And before joining AWINSA, she was with Ranbaxy as a manager in the Department of Medical Affairs and Pharmacovigilance. She comes with an extensive experience in various safety databases like Argus and EDIS Global for case processing, reporting, and product license management. And she has met challenges of business continuity planning and data restoration. So I'll hand over to Dr. Mukta to start the session.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you, Sanjeev, for the nice introduction. So in the webinar today, we will be talking about the Development Safety Update Report, which is the aggregate report for the products under investigation. I'll talk about the objectives of the DSUR, the scope of the DSUR, general principles while preparing and submitting the DSUR. Sanjeev in his presentation will talk about the content of the DSUR and the sectional presentation of the DSUR. From safety perspective, comprehensive and critical analysis of the evolving information on the risks and evidence of benefits must be identified and reported for any investigational product. So all of this is clearly reflected in the aggregate reports, which are required to be prepared as a part of the pharmacovigilance requirements. Aggregate reports are the reports which emphasize on evaluation of the safety profile and benefit risk and do not focus on individual cases as such. Aggregate reporting, so as to say, is the process which covers or which reviews the cumulative safety information from a wide range of sources on a periodic basis and submit the findings to the regulatory authorities worldwide. Aggregate reports are required both during the pre-marketing and the post-marketing stages of a product. With regard to the aggregate reporting in clinical trials, if we look from the historical perspective, INT annual report was considered as the aggregate report to be submitted by the sponsor in the US. Similarly, Europe had annual safety reports, and as a part of the harmonization, US and European regulators considered that DSUR can be submitted by the sponsor conducting the clinical trials globally, which would also meet the national and the regional requirements. Like any other aggregate report, there are many stakeholders in the preparation of the DSUR too. All these stakeholders help in providing the data to the medical writers for preparation of the DSUR. Just to take an example, data is required for worldwide marketing authorization to be included in the DSUR, which is provided by the sponsor's regulatory affairs department. Clinical operations team is required to share the data regarding the status of the clinical trials, how many are ongoing, how many are completed, along with the subject exposure in the development program to the investigational product. Safety data to be presented in the DSUR, for example, line listings or summary tabulations, that comes from safety team managing the safety of the study. Thus, it is very important for different departments of the sponsor team to have a kickoff meeting before initiating the preparation of the DSUR so that the DSUR can be prepared in a seamless manner and submitted within the reporting timelines as per the regulatory requirements. The main objective of a DSUR is to present a comprehensive annual review and evaluation of pertinent safety information collected during the reporting period related to a drug under investigation, whether or not it is marketed, by examining whether the information obtained by the sponsor during the reporting period is in accordance with the previous knowledge of the investigational drug safety. So overall emphasis is on the cumulative data and not just the reporting period data. And other objectives are to describe the new safety issues that could have an impact on the protection of the clinical trial subjects and to provide an update on the status of the clinical development program. One of the most important objectives is to summarize the current understanding and management of identified and potential risks. So what is an identified risk? So it is basically an untoward occurrence for which there is an adequate evidence of an association with the investigational medicinal product. For example, any adverse reaction which is demonstrated in non-clinical studies and confirmed by clinical data, or any adverse reaction which is observed in the clinical trials which is having actually a causal relationship with the investigational medicinal product. Similarly, potential risk is any such untoward occurrence for which there is some basis for suspicion of a causal relationship with the product, with the investigational medicine product, but the causal association is still not confirmed as such. For example, the non-clinical safety concerns that are not confirmed in the human clinical trials. So DSUR should be thus concise and provide information to assure the regulators that sponsors are adequately monitoring and evaluating the evolving safety profile of the investigational product. The main focus of the DSUR data and findings from the interventional trials of drugs that are under investigation, whether or not they have the marketing approval. Because clinical development of a drug frequently continues following marketing approval, relevant information from post-marketing studies should also be included in the DSUR. The DSUR should concentrate primarily on the investigational drug, providing information on the comparators only where relevant to the safety of the trial subjects. So the DSUR should provide safety information from all ongoing clinical trials and other studies that the sponsor is conducting or has completed during the reporting period. And these studies include the clinical trials using an investigational drug like human pharmacological trials or the therapeutic confirmatory trials like from phase 1 to phase 3. Any clinical trial which is conducted using marketed drugs in approved indications like phase 4 trials, or therapeutic use of the investigational drug like expanded access programs or compassionate use programs, and the clinical trials conducted to support changes in the manufacturing process of medicinal products. The DSUR should also include the significant findings pertinent to the safety of the investigational products, including findings from any observational study or any epidemiological study or any non-clinical study like toxicological or in vitro studies, any other related DSURs if applicable for the investigational product, or the studies which are recently published in the literature. So this is the scope of the DSUR, which includes all the information from different sources to be included primarily in the DSUR to present the safety information. So periodic safety update report is the aggregate report required for post-marketing phase of the product. What is the relationship of the DSUR to the periodic safety report? So at present, some ICH countries and regions accept submission of a periodic safety update report to fulfill the national and regional requirements for periodic reporting on the safety of the approved products. Although the focus of the DSUR is on investigational drugs, there can be an overlap between the content of the DSUR and the PSUR. For example, information from marketing experience, which is reported in the PSUR, might be relevant to clinical development and therefore reported in the DSUR too. Safety findings from clinical trials conducted using marketed drugs would be included in the DSUR, but would also be pertinent to post-marketing safety and would be reported in the PSUR too. So both the DSUR and the PSUR should be comprehensive and standalone document as such, as they focus on different subject matter and they have different periodicities and different recipients. Now, where all DSUR is required to be submitted? The DSUR is intended to serve as an annual report to the regulatory authorities. And as I mentioned in the beginning, a harmonized report is now being submitted to the ICH regions largely. Still, there are some nuances specifically for certain regions where some specific format might be required for the aggregate report for clinical trials. I would like to clarify regarding the submission to the ethics committees or institutional review boards. Generally, ethics committees or IRBs, they require executive summary of the DSUR to be submitted to them, unless they have any specific requirement as per their standard operating procedures or as per their processes. This executive summary is supplemented with the line listing of the serious adverse reactions to them. So the ethics committee or the IRB, when we submit the reports to them, so it should be the executive summary of the DSUR. Along with that, we have to submit the line listings or the summary tabulation of the DSUR along with that. There are some general principles which have to be followed for the preparation of the DSUR. So in order to promote a comprehensive analysis and presentation of safety profile of the investigational drug, a sponsor should prepare a single DSUR with data pertinent to all dosage forms, all strengths, all the indications in all patient populations under study with investigational drug. If more than one sponsor is involved in the drug development, particularly in a co-development or other contractual agreement, then a single DSUR can be submitted. Talking about the periodicity at which a DSUR should be submitted. So the Development International Birth Rate, or we say DIBD, is used to determine the start of the annual period of the DSUR. This date is the sponsor's first authorization to conduct a clinical trial in any country worldwide. The start of the annual period for the DSUR is the month and the date of the DIBD. So when the sponsor's first clinical trial is conducted in a country without a formal authorization process, the sponsor then in that scenario should designate an appropriate date linked to the commencement of the first clinical trial. Where clinical trials are ongoing in one country and are later initiated in some other country, the original DIBD should always be maintained and used for all the countries in preparation of the DSUR. The data log point of the DSUR should be the last date of the 1 year reporting period. So this is the periodicity and submission or the reporting period for the DSUR based on the DIBD. So as I mentioned earlier, as DSUR has to be submitted to the concerned regulatory authorities within 60 days of the data log point, it is very important that a kickoff meeting is conducted and data is provided to the medical writers within a week or 10 days so that the DSUR can be effectively drafted and reviewed and submitted to the regulatory authorities within the defined timeframes. So when clinical development of a drug continues following a marketing approval in any country, both a PSUR and a DSUR should be submitted as specified by the national laws or regulations. So if a sponsor wants DSUR can be prepared based on the PSUR IBD as well, so that the DSUR and PSUR can be synchronized. And in synchronizing the data log points for the DSUR and PSUR, the period covered by the next DSUR should be no longer be more than a 1 year. And the DSUR should be submitted to all the concerned regulatory authorities no later than 60 calendar days after the data log point, after the DSUR data log point. Now, duration of the DSUR submissions. So The DSURs should continue to be submitted for as long as indicated by the national or the regional laws or regulations. It all depends on individual country requirements too. For example, in the US, the sponsors might keep an IND open even if no clinical trials are ongoing or planned, and annual reports are submitted for as long as the IND remains open. When submission of an annual report is no longer required in any country, it should always be indicated that the final DSUR serves as the last annual report for that investigational drug in that particular country. There are certain responsibilities of different stakeholders regarding the DSUR. The sponsors of a clinical trial, they are responsible for preparation and submission of a DSUR. The sponsor can delegate the responsibility of the DSUR to a third party like a CRO who can prepare and submit the DSURs on behalf of the sponsor too. In situations where the sponsor does not have access to the information to be included in the specific sections, for example, the sponsor investigators, that is an individual who both initiates and conducts a clinical trial alone or with the others, and under whose direction the investigational product is actually administered to the subjects. Such sponsor investigators might not have the information on certain sections of the DSUR like manufacturing issues or non-clinical data or marketing status. So in this situation, if they do not have this information, it should always be clearly mentioned in the DSUR. Now, there are responsibilities of certain parties, multiple parties as well. So when there is more than one sponsor of a clinical trial, the parties should arrange to prepare a single DSUR if possible. This includes situation where a sponsor is in a formal licensing relationship or a agreement with one or more partners, or where individual clinical trial involves collaboration with business partners or some of the other parties. But still, in these situations also, needless to say, written agreements should always be in place specifying how data will be exchanged and detailing the responsibilities for preparation and submission of the DSUR. When a single DSUR cannot be arranged, multiple sponsors can agree to prepare separate DSURs for the same investigational drug too. This can occur where different indications, route of administrations, or formulations are being investigated by different parties. In this situation, the rationale for separate DSURs should be provided in each and every report. So the sponsor should select the most appropriate option based on the judgment in case of the combination therapies. They should take into account the patient population, indication, formulation, as well as the circumstances in which the clinical trials are being conducted. And the rationale for this decision should always be provided in the report. In general, a single DSUR should be prepared for clinical trials involving fixed combination product, that is a product consisting of at least 2 active ingredients in a fixed dose that is administered in a single dosage form. If the sponsor is also conducting clinical trials with individual components of the fixed combination product, separate DSUR should be submitted for each component. And the relevant findings from each DSUR should be summarized in section 8.5, which is the new safety data related to the combination therapies in the DSUR. So anyway, Sanjeev will be talking about these section in detail in his presentation too, but just so that everybody knows that this should be included in section 8.5 of the DSUR. For trials involving multi-drug therapy, that is combination of drugs that are not fixed. So we were talking earlier about the fixed drug combinations. Now, which are not fixed, the sponsor can prepare either a DSUR for multi-drug therapy or a DSUR for one or more of the individual components and in the case information on the multi-drug therapy trials can be included in the DSUR of one or all of the components. So there are different strategies for preparation of the DSURs for multi-drug therapies. If you see the table here, this depicts different scenarios of multi-drug therapy used in the clinical trials. So if we talk about the first scenario, this is investigational drug A and marketed drugs XYZ, which were involved as multi-drug therapy in the clinical trial. In this situation, either a single DSUR should be prepared, which should focus on all the products like the investigational drug A and the marketed drugs, or a single DSUR just focusing on A should be prepared, including data on the multi-drug therapy too. And another situation is we have two investigational drugs, A and B. So either a single DSUR, which is focusing on A plus B, or two separate DSURs, one for one investigational product and the other for the other one, but each including data on the multi-drug therapy too. So reference safety information is one of the important section or part of the DSUR. And the investigator's brochure in effect at the start of the reporting period should serve as a reference safety information to determine whether the information received during the reporting period remains consistent with the previous knowledge of the safety profile of the investigation drug. Section 7.1 of the DSUR should clearly indicate the version number and the date of the IB used for this purpose. And when an IB is not required by national laws or regulations, the applicable national or regional product label should serve as the reference safety information. Usually a single document should serve as a reference safety information. However, in certain circumstances, it might be appropriate to use more than one reference document to support the DSUR. Like, for example, for a DSUR providing information on an investigational drug used in combination and as a monotherapy too. If the IB has been revised during the reporting period and not previously submitted to the relevant regulatory authority, the sponsors should provide a copy of the current version of the IB as an attachment to the DSUR, which is as one of the appendices too. So from RSI perspective, just one point to be emphasized is that there is the guideline which is published by the Clinical Trial Facilitation Group in EU, according to which the serious adverse reactions which are greater than or equal to 2 should be included as part of the RSI in the IB. Any serious adverse reaction occurring just once should only be included in the RSI table if there is a strong causal relationship between the event and the investigational drug. So this is the sectional presentation of the DSUR and the recommended format and content of the DSUR, including the table of contents, section numbering, and content of each section. For each heading where information is available, the information should be presented concisely so that regulators can easily review the information. And wherever no information is available or a DSUR section is not applicable, this should be clearly stated that this information is not applicable. Sanjeev will be presenting the sectional review in detail in his presentation too. But there are different sections, if you can see, including the cumulative exposure or the data in the line listings and summary tabulation, which is actually coming from different departments of the sponsor team, from regulatory affairs, from data management, from clinical operations, or from safety department too. So the most important point is inclusion of the safety data, any significant finding from the clinical trials during the reporting period. And there is section 18 and 19, which is the overall safety assessment or the evaluation of the benefit risks, and ultimately the conclusion of the DSUR based on the information what has been presented in the DSUR for that particular reporting period. Now, the title page of the DSUR should include some of the information like the DSUR number. And the important point is that reports should be numbered sequentially. Then the investigational drug name should be clearly depicted or presented on the title page, and the reporting period, which is the annual reporting period, and the date of the report. Along with that, the sponsor name and address should be clearly defined or mentioned on the title page, and then a statement on the confidentiality of the information included in the DSUR. And obviously, there is a cautionary statement that DSUR includes unblinded information if applicable, and this is true both for the regulatory and the ethics committee submissions. Now, before we start on with the sectional review, just the executive summary. So this section should provide a concise summary of the important information contained in the report. Together with the title page, it can serve as a standalone document which is suitable for submission to ethics committees or the IRBs and any other stakeholder if required by the national or the regional laws. The information which should be included in the executive summary is the introduction, which includes the report number and the reporting period. Then the investigational drug, its mode of action, the therapeutic class, indication, dose. I mean, everything about the investigational drug which has to be included, including the route of administration or formulation. Then estimated cumulative exposure of clinical trial subjects, marketing approval, if the product is marketed or not, and if it is marketed, then in how many countries it is marketed, and then the summary of the overall safety assessment based on the section 18, the summary of which is presented in the body of the DSUR 2, and the summary of the important risks based on the section 19 of the body of the DSUR. And finally, the actions taken for safety reasons, including the significant changes to the IB and ultimately the conclusion section. So this all encompasses the presentation in the executive summary of the DSUR, which is presented before the body of the DSUR starts. So this is all what I have for today. And before I hand over to Sanjeev for his presentation, I would like to briefly introduce him. So Dr. Sanjeev Miglani is the founder and director of AWINSA Life Sciences. He's an MD in internal medicine and has over 20 years of experience in the field of medicine, pharmacovigilance, and clinical research. In his last assignment, he was the Vice President of Safety and Medical Affairs at AWINSA. And just before joining AWINSA, Sanjeev was Vice President for Pharmacovigilance and Medical Writing at Accenture. Before joining Accenture, Sanjeev was the Chief Operating Officer and Scientific Director of CIDP. And prior to CIDP, Sanjeev was Director of Medical Affairs at CleanRx. Before CleanRx, he worked with Ranbaxy as a Senior Manager in the Department of Medical Affairs and Pharmacovigilance. And he has also worked as Senior Resident in Cardiology and Medicine Department in some of the prestigious hospitals of New Delhi. He's a lifetime member of and fellow of Indian Association of Clinical Medicine and has numerous publications in medical journals and books to his credit. So Sanjeev, over to you, and thank you so much for listening to the presentation. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Thanks, Mugdha. So thanks for the nice introduction. So in my session, I'll be talking about the different sections which are required to be captured in the DSUR as per ICH-E2F guidelines. And before I start talking about the different sections, as Mugdha explained, DSUR is basically a document that has to be prepared by a team from different verticals, because it's more of a teamwork. The data needs to come from the non-clinical team, the clinical operations team, who will provide the clinical exposure data. And then, of course, the safety team has to play a very vital role in compiling the document. And of course, all the safety information, whether it is line listing or summary tabulation, that always is generated from the safety database. All right, so the first part of the presentation or the section is introduction. And in this particular section, in the introduction section, we have to include the DIBD, which is the date of international birth date, or IBD. So date of international birth date is basically the date when the clinical trials in human population are approved for the first time. So once any clinical trial in the human population starts, so the approval date is the date of international birth date, and 1 year from that particular date, there is a requirement for DSUR, and that is basically required to be done every year if the clinical trials are operational. We have to provide the reporting period and sequential number of the report in the introduction section. Of course, it's very important to provide the details of the investigational drug, the mode of action, therapeutic class, dose, and route of administration. We also need to provide a brief description of the indications and the populations which are being studied. So if there are more than one indication, so we have to mention about all those multiple indications for which the clinical trials are being done. And we also need to include in this section any description and explanation of any information that has not been included in the DSUR. Well, this can also practically happen in some instances when you have some safety data partners, wherein some other partner is also conducting a clinical trial with the same molecule. Generally, it's very important that whenever a DSUR is prepared, so if there is a safety information coming from a partner for the same molecule, so that information is required to be captured in the DSUR. But in case if there are some practical challenges and due to some reason the information is not available from the other partner for the same molecule with regard to safety or any safety concern, so that rationale has to be captured in the introduction section. In section 2, we have to provide the worldwide marketing approval status. Of course, this is applicable if the product is also being marketed at the same time. There are some scenarios, especially in oncology indications and infectious disease indications, when you might have a product which is being investigated in clinical trial, but maybe you also have an approval for another indication in the market. So if there is a data regarding the marketing approval, so this section should provide a brief narrative overview, including the date of first approval, the approved dose, and wherever approved, if applicable. Of course, if there is a tabulation format available with you, so you can provide even that format also. But the thing is that this is more applicable when the product is also authorized at the same time. The section 3 should talk about significant actions related to safety that have been taken during the reporting period by the sponsors, the regulatory authorities. It could be the data monitoring committees or ethics committee, which have an impact on the conduct of the specific clinical trials on the overall clinical development program. So, of course, if there is any change to the RSI, there is a separate section for that. But any significant action which have been taken for safety reasons, they should be mentioned, and they could be, for example, refusals to authorize the clinical trial, or maybe there could be a partial or complete clinical trial suspension. There can be recall of the investigational drug or comparator. There can be scenarios where some risk management activities have been implemented, which could be including protocol modifications or restriction to the study population, or changes in the informed consent, or formulation of the formulation changes. So if any such action is taken during the reporting period, so it has to be provided. And then, of course, there could be some scenarios where the actions could be taken related to the market drugs. Again, this scenario is only applicable if the product is also marketed at the same time for a different indication. So any such action which could be related to failure to obtain a marketing approval renewal, or withdrawal or suspension of a marketing approval, or if there is any particular significant restriction on the distribution of that product due to some safety reason, or if there is any new post-marketing study requirement which have been imposed by the regulators. So all of these things have to be mentioned in the actions with regard to market product. The section 4, as you see, is the changes to the reference safety information, and this particular section should list any significant safety related changes to the IP or other reference safety information within the reporting period. And Mugdha was talking about the CTFG guidance document, so it's very important that first of all, as we all know, that as per the CTFG guidance document, and we in fact had conducted a webinar also on that particular guideline. So we know that in the RSI, first of all, a very important thing is the RSI table, which should always contain only those serious adverse reactions which have occurred at least once. So practically anything which has occurred more than once should be captured in the RSI table. And of course, there should be a reasonable causal association. For then only they should become expected serious adverse reaction. But yes, there is an exception to the rule. If there is a single SAR also, which is having a strong causal association with the drug, so even that can be captured in the RSI table as an exception. So that's what the CTFG guidance document say. So if we are preparing the DSUR on a yearly basis, so in the next DSUR cycle, if we see a new particular serious adverse reaction is becoming a part of that RSI table, so such changes have to be highlighted in the reference safety information. Similarly, if there's an increase in the frequency of already existing serious adverse reactions, so that also needs to be highlighted in the changes to the RSI section. And of course, there are other sections like contraindications, warning, precautions, adverse events of special interest, or drug interactions. So they're also part of the reference safety information. So if there are any changes which are related to these particular sections, so they have to be captured in the changes to the reference safety information. Section 5 is the inventory of clinical trials, and this is including both ongoing and completed clinical trials. And we have to provide the detailed information in a tabular fashion. So if you look into the ICH E2 guidelines, so there is a format that has been provided for both ongoing and completed studies. So if you look into these tables, practically we have to provide the information regarding the phase, the status of the trial, the countries, the design, whether it's an open label or it's a single blind or double blind, or the dose and the regimen of the investigation drug, the study population as appropriate, and then the date of clinical trial start. Well, there is a section on the cumulative exposure, which have to be again provided in a tabular format. And if the summary tabulations of the serious adverse events are presented by the indication, the exposure data should also be presented by indication wherever available. So because that would be a much wiser option, because if you have different indications, so it can be provided accordingly. And for marketed drugs which are under clinical investigation, it might not be feasible or useful to obtain the precise cumulative clinical trial exposure data. Now, this is a kind of a example that has been given in ICH E2F. In fact, I've taken it directly from ICH E2F. So if you have the clinical trial going on and we need to provide a cumulative subject exposure, so we can always have patients who would be on specific drug. So again, I want to clarify here that for the purpose of DSUR preparation, we don't have to do any unblinding. So if we know that a particular population in a particular trial, which is double blinded, so they are on blinded therapy, so that entire population can be captured as such. Their numbers can be counted in the blinded therapy. But yes, if there is an open label trial going on with the same molecule, or if we know that, okay, these are the patients on comparator and these are the patients on placebo, so then those numbers can be included. But if a particular population is already in a blinded therapy and the trial is not completed and the data is not available for the individual arms, so we have to just provide the numbers or the patient count on the blinded therapy. And then we have to provide the cumulative number of subjects which are exposed to the investigational drug from ongoing and clinical trial, which can be divided by age, gender, and the racial group. Now, as I talked about the scenario wherein if a particular medicinal product or the investigation product is also approved for a particular indication at the same time, so then we have to provide the patient exposure from the marketing experience. And practically, the calculation has to be done in a similar manner, like the way we do in the PSURs or any post-marketing periodic reports. So let me give an example. So if there is a drug that has to be given on a daily basis, like a anti-diabetic or anti-hypertensive, so practically whatever number of tablets are sold or whatever number of capsules are sold for an anti-diabetic medication, so if we just divide by 365, so practically we get roughly the patient treatment years, which is a rough count of number of patients who have been exposed to that particular product. Similarly, like if there is an antibiotic, say, which has to be given 3 times in a day on an average for 7 days. So of course, first of all, we have to make a rough assumption, because whenever you see in the prescribing information, you would see a range. But then we have to just make a assumption, which is basically an average intake, which is taken by the patient. And say, as I gave the example of an antibiotic, say, which is to be given 3 times a day for 7 days. So if we just divide the number of particular antibiotic tablets sold or the capsules sold by 21, so we would get the patient treatment courses, and practically these are the number of patients that have been exposed. So that's obviously a kind of a high level number which can be projected in the periodic report. So as I mentioned, this is something similar to the PSUR that we do. So that's how the numbers can be provided. And there's a section on line listing of the serious adverse reaction, and then the summary tabulation also needs to be provided. So there is a format which is given as per ICH E2F. So we have to provide the line listings as per the ICH E2F format, and then the cumulative tabulations of the serious adverse events that have been reported to the sponsor since the date of international birth date. Well, the summary tabulations in a DSUR should always include all the SAEs and not just SARs for the investigation drug and the comparator. And ICH E2F mentioned that the line listings and tabulation should include blinded and unblinded clinical trial data. So this section of reference safety information should specify the version of the coding dictionary. So whatever MedDRA version has been used, so that should be specifically mentioned. And the reference information, so it's not the reference safety section, it's the reference information section, what I mean to say. And this should specify the document and version which is used as RSI for determining the expectedness for the tabulations for wherever required by any national or regional laws or regulations. Now, this is the format of the line listings of the serious adverse reaction. Again, this is something which is exactly taken from ICH E2F. And as you would know that this particular section is patient specific, and summary tabulation is always like a count of the particular adverse event or the serious adverse event that has occurred. But when we talk about line listing as a process, when we generate it from any database like Argus or Eris Global, so it has a standard template as per ICH E2F, so which has to contain the case ID, the subject ID, the country from where the case occurred, the serious adverse reaction which happened, the outcome of the event, the date of time of onset, the suspect drug, daily dose formulation, or the route and formulation, I mean. And of course, if somebody wants to make any customization, they can always do that. But these are the minimum parameters that have to be there, which the regulatory authorities expect that they should be there in the line listing. Similarly, there is a format of summary tabulation. If you see here, so you can see an example again, which is provided in ICH E2F, that the patient could be taking study drug, comparator, placebo, and as I mentioned earlier also, for the purpose of DSUR, whatever data is there in the form of blinded therapy, so that has to be provided as it is. Of course, if there is any data which is already available after the unblinding has been done because the study is completed, so that can be provided. Otherwise, the data always remain blinded, and whatever is available because of the open label studies, so that can be provided, and whatever counts are there for those events, so that can be mentioned in the tabulation. And again, we don't have to create it manually. This data comes from the database if somebody is using the safety database. Now, section 8 is the significant findings from the clinical trials during the reporting period. And if we look into this section, it has to be broken down into different subsections. Like, first of all, we have to provide the data about the clinical trials which are completed. So we have to provide any important safety concerns which are coming from that particular completed trial. And this information can be presented in the form of a narrative format or as a synopsis. And it should also include information that supports or refutes any previously identified safety issues as well as any new safety signals. Well, I described the completed clinical trials. So then about the ongoing clinical trials, again, we have to mention if a sponsor is already aware of any important information, because maybe if there are any SUSARs which have happened and based on the unblinding or based on the evaluation that has been done, if we know that there is an important safety concern, so of course that has to be mentioned. And of course, sometimes what happens is that in the ongoing trials, especially if they're blinded, we may not be able to make a interpretation of a important safety concern unless some interim analysis has been done or unblinding has been done for some SUSARs. So the idea is that whatever data is available, if there are some ongoing signals which have been identified, so we can mention about that. And if there is a confirmed safety signal that has been identified, so again, that should be mentioned for those ongoing trials in this section. There can be some situations, especially we have seen in oncology trials, wherein sometimes the regulatory authorities expect a long-term follow-up. And if there are clinical trials where long-term follow-up is done for subjects, so and if there is any particular safety concern that comes up during the follow-up, say if we get to know that there are long-term implications in terms of hepatotoxicity or carcinogenicity as a part of the follow-up of the subject. So of course, these are some safety concerns that can be identified. So, and if any such safety concern is identified in a long-term follow-up of a particular clinical trial, so that has to be captured in this particular section. Section 8.4 is the section on other therapeutic uses of investigation drug, and this particular section should include clinically important safety information from other programs conducted by the sponsor that follow a specific protocol with solicited reporting, and that could be in form of expanded access programs or compassionate access program, particular patient use or single patient INDs, and the treatment INDs. There can be combination therapies, and if there is a particular new safety data related to combination therapy, so we have to provide the information in this section. So if say the DSUR is for an investigation drug that is also under development as a component of a fixed combination therapy or a multi-drug regimen, so this particular section should summarize important safety findings from the combination therapy DSUR. Of course, if there is a fixed drug combination product. So there will be a DSUR which will be created separately for that particular fixed drug combination. But what I'm trying to say is that since if we are dealing with a particular active moiety of that fixed drug combination for which the DSUR is prepared, it's important that if we know about any safety concerns coming from the combination, so that particular information needs to be captured in the individual active moiety DSUR, and the vice versa also has to be taken into account. So if the DSUR is being prepared for a combination therapy, and if we know that there is a safety concern that we already know for one of those active moieties, so we have to provide the important safety information about that particular active moiety. There could be some safety findings that could come up from the non-intervention study. So if there are any safety concerns, or if there is any relevant safety information that comes up from non-intervention studies, so that has to be captured. And these could be anything like observation studies or epidemiology studies or registries or any active surveillance program. Again, if there is any data, idea is to capture any relevant safety concern. So if it comes from any other source also, and that source could be any pooled analysis or any meta-analysis of randomized clinical trial, or if there is any safety information which is provided by any co-development partners, or if it could be any IIT investigator-initiated trial. So the safety concerns coming from any of these sources have to be captured in this particular section 10. Safety finding from marketing experience also are to be required to be captured in the DSUR, and this could be again only applicable first of all if the drug is also marketed at the same time while the clinical trials are also ongoing. So a concise summary of the key safety findings have to be captured, and idea is not to just capture any important risk or safety concern. If there is some information regarding any off-label use or any data regarding overdose, abuse, medication error, which is significant, so we have to provide that information in this particular section. The section regarding non-clinical data should mention about major safety findings from a non-clinical in vivo and in vitro study, and the implications of these findings should be discussed in the overall safety assessment. Now, the literature is a very important piece of DSUR, and whenever we are preparing the DSUR, so we have to summarize any new and significant safety findings which are published in the scientific literature. So I don't mean to say that we have to just provide all the abstracts that we screen. Of course, that is done as a part of the overall literature screening exercise. But when we are reviewing all those abstracts, or when we are reviewing those particular articles, so if we get across any information which is of relevant safety concern, so that has to be mentioned in the literature section. Otherwise, we just, if we don't get any safety concern, we can always mention that there were no new safety concern that came from the literature screening. Now, if there are some other DSURs, as I mentioned earlier, there could be some scenarios where some other partner could be also conducting some clinical trial, and the partner might have prepared some other DSUR. So first of all, it's important that there is a safety exchange between the partners. And if the sponsor is preparing, say, multiple DSURs, then the section should summarize significant finding from the other DSURs. I mean, like practically, ideally, most of the companies would do just one DSUR for a single investigation drug. But in case they are preparing more than one DSUR for the same molecule, maybe because of some specific reason, like there is a specific data for a particular indication, of course, if they're doing it, they anyway need to mention the safety concerns for in both the DSURs. And when available, the sponsor should summarize significant finding from the DSURs provided by other sponsors. Again, the idea is the same, because if the active moiety is same, so the safety concerns have to be communicated with the other stakeholders so that they can capture that information in their respective DSURs. Well, lack of efficacy section is also very important, and sometimes people get confused when the information regarding lack of efficacy is required to be captured. The regulatory authorities are not expecting any kind of a line listing or a summary tabulation for lack of efficacy. The idea is to first of all emphasize if there is a lack of efficacy which is coming for drugs which are used for life-threatening condition, or maybe if there is a lack of efficacy which is related to the established therapy for an investigational drug which is intended to treat serious or life-threatening illness. So if a clinical trial is going on for a indication like acute coronary syndrome, and there is a well-established, say, antiplatelet therapy like clopidogrel, which is already established. Now, if a clinical trial is going on for a new medication which is an antiplatelet, but we find a lot of lack of efficacy cases with that new investigational product, and those lack of efficacy cases are much higher compared to the conventional antiplatelet clopidogrel therapy, or maybe any other conventional therapy that is being given which is already established in the market. So then obviously it becomes a cause of concern. So it means that a clinical trial is being conducted on a molecule for which there are higher lack of efficacy cases, or then you're getting more of the acute coronary syndrome cases because the underlying disease itself is flaring up. So obviously when we get those kind of symptoms, then we have to document all those details or the safety concern. Otherwise, routine lack of efficacy here and there doesn't mean that we have to capture those details. It's just for a specific purpose that this section is created, as I mentioned. Then there are some regional specific data that has to be provided, and these are mentioned in the ICH E2F. So examples include the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse reactions by SOC, adverse reaction term, and treatment arm. So earlier I mentioned the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse event, which is overall which is required to be given in a particular section 7 or 6. But this is a specific regional specific information which is for cumulative summary tabulation of the SAR. Similarly, there are other data points required in this section 16, like list of subjects who died or who dropped out of the clinical trials, or any safety issues which were identified from a review of these withdrawals. So all of this stuff has to be captured in this particular section. This section should also mention data points like any phase 1 protocol modification. This section should also talk about any manufacturing changes or microbiological changes. If there is any new clinical trial coming up, so in this section we have to describe any overall generalized investigational plan for the coming year. And if there are any outstanding business with respect to the US IND, say if FDA or any regulatory authority has asked for a particular data, so all that, and in fact this particular section of log of outstanding business is especially with regard regarding FDA. And if FDA has asked for a particular request, so we have to document that in in this particular section. The late breaking information is again also critically is also extremely important. Again, we don't have to provide a separate line listing of any assays which are occurring after the data log point. So what most of the companies would typically do is that after the data log point, if there are any major safety concerns that are coming, maybe if there are any serious adverse reactions which are unexpected that came up after the DLP, then maybe a summary of those kind of SARs can be prepared because they could be of safety concern. Otherwise, if there are routine assays which are coming after the DLP, so we can just mention that there is no late breaking information that is significant enough or that has any safety impact on the population. Well, and then lastly, we have to cover some important information about any overall safety assessment. If there is any new significant concern that comes up in this particular year or the cycle for which we are preparing the DSUR, there is a section 19, which is practically for the summary of the important risk. And like first of all, in section 18.1, we just capture the overall risk, the evaluation, but in section 19, which is maybe if you move to the next slide, which is section 19. So in this particular section, we have to talk about the important risk, the potential risk, and the missing information. So important identified risk is something wherein some information regarding the safety concerns have already been established. So if we know that a particular drug is known to cause hypersensitivity, or if we know that a particular drug is known to cause say hepatotoxicity or any known safety concerns, so they are kind of list of important identified risks. And of course, when I say important identified, that means that that can have an impact on the public health, and these are like more generally serious adverse reaction. So if a patient is just having rash and it's an established risk, that doesn't become an important identifier, because these could be non-specific, non-serious adverse events. But if there are some serious adverse events which are having a public health impact, so these are important identified, and those risks should be mentioned in the DSUR. Similarly, if there are some important potential risks which are not confirmed, when we say potential risk, I mean to say, as per the guidelines, these are the events for which the signal has not been confirmed, or with the causality or the causal association has not been confirmed. So we are just monitoring those signals, and if there are any important potential risks during the reporting period that have been identified, or even if they were identified earlier but they are still being monitored, so they have to be captured in this section. And then lastly, in the conclusion, we have to briefly describe any changes to the previous knowledge of efficacy and safety resulting from the information gained since the last DSUR. And the conclusion should outline any action that have been taken or will be taken to address any emerging safety issues in the clinical development program. So that's all that we have from the DSUR session. I think we have around 5 minutes or so we can take up some questions at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have good questions. The first one Magda will take. When does the requirement for DSUR submission start?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon. Yes, this is a good question. So basically a DSUR, as we were explaining earlier as well, so DSUR should be prepared after the first authorization of a clinical trial, and that has to be worldwide. I mean, not specific to any country. Worldwide, in case there is any approval of a clinical trial, so that DSUR, that should be considered as the development international birth date, and DSUR should be prepared after that. And DSUR is then prepared on an annual basis with the data log point or the DLP as 1 year from that DIBD. So the development international birth date till 1 year. So after that, there'll be a data log point, and for that annual report, the requirement of the DSUR shall start, and it gets repeated every year from there onwards.
Okay, thank you, Magda. The next question, Sanjeev will answer. Is a DSUR required for a clinical trial which is now in long-term follow-up phase?
Right, Sharon. Yeah, sure. I can answer that. Yes, if there is a clinical trial which is now having a follow-up phase, DSUR is absolutely required to be prepared for any such investigation product. In fact, the very important reason is that the follow-up phase of the clinical trial is to identify any safety concerns that could come up from a long-term use or the follow-up. So as per the ICH-ETF guidelines, the DSUR is required, and yes, if the follow-up has also finished and if the clinical trial is completed, then the DSURs are not required to be submitted to the authorities. But yes, if the clinical trial is still operational and we are collecting the data from the patients, because if they are in the long-term follow-up phase, yes, it has to be done.
The next question, how is the DLP, I believe that's data log point, defined? Magda will answer that.
I can answer this question. Thank you, Sharon. So DLP, yes, as Sharon mentioned, it is a data log point, and the DLP for the DSUR reporting period is actually the last date before the anniversary of the DIBD. So basically, for example, if the development international birth date of any investigational medicinal product is 1st April 2021, then the DLP or data log point for the preparation of the DSUR will be, or the reporting period will be 1st April 2021 to 31st March 2022. So that is 1 day before the DIBD of that particular product. And this is basically for 1 year, and reporting period is for 1 year, and DLP is defined in this manner.
Thanks, Magda. The next question, Sanjeev will answer, whether DSUR should contain unblinded data.
Yeah, sure. I would love to answer that. In fact, as I mentioned earlier in one of my slides, for the purpose of preparing the DSUR, there is no unblinding required at all, and the regulations are very clear about it. Of course, if the data is already unblinded because the study is completed, and if we know if there are particular events or the serious adverse events which were on a particular individual arm, So all those details, of course, can be mentioned in any DSUR. But if a clinical trial is ongoing, and if we are having obviously no idea about the serious adverse events on a particular arm, so everything goes into that blinded arm. So in my slides, I had shown the data for cumulative serious adverse events earlier. So then we have to provide the data for comparator, the study drug, and then the blinded therapy. So if the data is not unblinded, so whatever assays are in that blinded arm, so that can be captured. Similarly, like there is a section for cumulative exposure. So there could be scenarios where the patient could be on some individual particular study drug or comparator, wherever the data is already unblinded, because say the study was open label. So that can be captured as it is. But if the study is ongoing and if there is a blinded study, so then wherever you have the blinded population, so that data will just goes as it is. And there is obviously no requirement, or obviously the regulations were very clear that the data is not required to be unblinded just for the purpose of DSUR.
Thanks, Sanjeev. We have two last questions. You'll take the next one, please. Is a DSUR required for comparators too?
Sure, Sharon, I can take that too. So see, the idea of the DSUR is to prepare the safety report for the concerned investigational product. Of course, there are comparators in clinical trials. So, but the intent of the DSUR is not to provide the safety information or the safety concerns of the comparator product, because they're already anyway established, and that's not the responsibility of the sponsor. Of course, when there are any DSURs or any safety concern that comes up because of a particular individual cases, so that reporting has to be done by the sponsors as a part of the regulatory requirement. But the DSUR is meant primarily for the investigational medicinal product which is being investigated, so it's not for the comparator.
And the last question from Magda, can a DSUR be aligned with the PSUR's international birth date?
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. I'll answer this question. So yes, the dates of a DSUR and the PSUR, the submission for these dates for the documents can be synchronized basically by preparing a DSUR based on the PSUR international birth date. So the way it happens is that DLP of DSUR is then aligned with the PSUR international birth date, but the main point for consideration, and which I mentioned in one of my slides too, is that when we do this kind of a synchronization, so the most important point which has to be taken into consideration is that the period of the first DSUR should not be more than 1 year. So it has to be 1 year, and then the data can for the DSUR, then that can be aligned with the PSUR international birth date, and moving forward both DSUR and PSUR can be synchronized for submission, which becomes easy for the sponsors to submit if they have the approval of the product as well as product is in the investigational phase.
Oh, thanks, Magda, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar. We really appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar on a Friday. So thank you so much, and we will soon be coming up with some additional webinars, so stay tuned. Thank you all, and happy weekend.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.